Hey guys, welcome to episode 1 of the Science-Centric podcast. Yes, you heard that correctly. Even though we've produced 21 episodes thus far, we're kicking it old school and reposting our very first episode from the fall of 2018, which after the events of the past year seems like a really long time ago. The reason we're posting an older episode is that I'm working on a new series for the Science-Centric YouTube channel, and we had to put the podcast on hold for a bit. We'll be back soon enough though, so until then, I thought you might enjoy hearing our very first episode with the wonderful science and environmental journalist, Rachel Nuwer. But before we get into it, just a few quick reminders. 1, if you want to see more content like this, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Number 2, find out how you can support our work by going to sciencecentric.com/support. Okay, enough of that claptrap. Let's get on with episode 1. In this episode, I'm pleased to have as my guest award-winning journalist Rachel Nuwer. Rachel has written for just about all the major players in science journalism, the New York Times, National Geographic, Wired, Scientific American, etc., etc. And she's covered everything from semiconductors to pierogies to autism. But the subject she's covered the most, her raison d'etre, if you will, is the illegal wildlife trade. This is also the topic of her brand new book, Poached, Inside the Dark World of Wildlife Trafficking, which just came out yesterday. On a rainy Thursday afternoon in Brooklyn, I spoke with Rachel about the process of writing her book and what can be done to stop the illegal wildlife trade, particularly in Asia. Rachel Nuwer, welcome to the Science-Centric podcast, the first podcast in the upcoming series, which hopefully goes on for a very long time.
Forever and ever.
So one really cool thing about this is that you were my last guest on the previous podcast that I hosted, and now you're my first guest on this podcast. So
it's a beautiful symmetry.
Yes. And the reason that I thought it would be great to have you on this podcast is you have a new book coming out September 25th.
Yes, September 25th in North America, October 10th in the rest of the English-speaking world.
Yes, and the book is called Poached, Inside
the Dark World of Wildlife Trafficking. Boom.
Great. So I guess to start, what was the origin of this book? Why did you... I mean, there's this subject has actually been covered quite a bit. There's quite a few books out there like this. So what made you want to write this book? And I guess maybe what's different about this than other books about wildlife trafficking?
Great question. I guess it depends on how far back you want to go with this origin story. I grew up on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, so I was surrounded by woods in my backyard, bayous and beaches a mile away, barrier islands, all kinds of cool nature. My house was also the kind of nexus of any stray or hurt animal, whether like a squirrel or an iguana or a kitten that people would find. Mm-hmm. So I loved animals. I grew up with animals and wildlife. I thought I wanted to be a scientist. So I studied biology, and then I went on to a master's degree in ecology, which took me to Vietnam for my research. And I was investigating some illegal wildlife trade stuff in a couple national parks in this really boggy, peat swampy area called U Minh. And while I was there, I heard about Vietnam's last Javan rhino being killed for its horn. And I was just like, what? Like, how could that even happen? Like, your last rhino and now it's dead, and like, why? Yeah. And meanwhile, there were all these media stories building about African rhinos being poached for their horns, about elephants being killed for their tusks, but it wasn't like a big thing at this time. This is 2009, 2010. It was just kind of building. Meanwhile, while all this global news was transpiring, I was realizing that I really didn't like science. Mm-hmm. I wasn't good at it. It was like nitpicky details, and I hated statistics. I do love writing though, and I still loved science. So science journalism was the solution for me. I moved to New York to do a program in science journalism, and
which I know well.
Yeah, which brought us together on this fine afternoon. And
so we're both graduates of the SHIRT program at NYU.
Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program.
Yes.
It's great.
Yes.
Exactly. So when I went to SHIRP, I already knew that I was interested in poaching and illegal wildlife trade. You know, I had seen this small slice of it in Vietnam, just on a very local level. I had seen it in the news, and for many of my assignments at NYU, I was writing about it. And again, at this time, like, everybody knows about it now, but people back then did not really, it wasn't on people's radar as much.
Yeah. Do you just mean in the popular press?
Yeah, in the popular press. Like, if you look back, there were a few stories here and there. But, you know, it was like, oh, some elephants got poached in Kenya, moving on. It wasn't, I guess people in the field were realizing it was becoming this giant threat once again, like it was in the 70s and 80s, but the public, it was still just kind of this faint whispering.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I graduated from SHIRP in 2011, and I immediately wanted to write this book. But, you know, I'm a new journalist. I didn't know what I was doing. I even put a proposal together, sent it out, and agents and editors were like, no, this is way too depressing. No one's going to want to read this book.
Oh, wow.
So I was like, okay, I guess they're professionals. They know what they're talking about. They must be right.
Yeah.
So I kind of gave up on the idea. But meanwhile, this crisis has just been building and building. And now, you know, pretty much anyone who reads a newspaper or follows online news should have some awareness that this is happening in Africa and Asia.
Yeah.
Yeah, so with this book, how is it different? There's...
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, so this book is basically like 8 years in the making.
Yeah, I mean,
and how long
good
did it
God,
take
even
you to,
longer.
How long
like,
did it take you to write it?
So...
Like report it.
Right, yeah. Well, like I said, I had kind of given up on it. Well, I had given up on it.
Yeah.
And then one of my mentors, who you know, Dan Fagan,
yes.
his book agent, came back from this trip to Kenya, and she came back to New York, and somehow in Kenya her eyes had been opened to this problem, and she's like, I discovered this thing, I have to find someone to write about it, like, we have to tell the world and save the animals.
Right.
And she was talking to Dan about this, and Dan's like, I know somebody who could do that. So he set up a meeting with us, and even then I was kind of like, I don't know if I want to deal with this. This sounds like kind of a black hole for time and money. But I also realized this is my chance to finally realize this dream and give it a shot and get word out.
Yeah. So sorry to interrupt, but you were talking about, you know, how this book is different than other journalists that have covered this. Right. And I will say that my thought on that and how it's different is it's the voice that you have through this book and the stories that you tell and the people that we meet along the way. I just found it so interesting, and you just get involved in these people's stories. Yeah,
I mean, I love animals, but to be honest, I don't want to read a book about like animals for 300 pages, you know, like it's human stories that humans find compelling, and I know that as well as anybody else. So, well, first of all, how is it different? There's all these news stories out there. They're really scattershot. They're freaking depressing. They're just like, all these animals are getting killed. I felt like what was missing in that conversation was context. Like, how is this entire global contraband industry linked together, and what are the overall impacts? What is driving the demand, and what is being done to stop it? Mm-hmm. And there are books out there that have done that, but again, I felt like they approached it from this very academic, very dry, here are the facts way, and it's just kind of overwhelming and sad to read those books. They're great, but...
and you just see a lot of statistics.
Yeah, like this many animals are dead, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, and your book definitely has that. I mean, you obviously have to share the data to sort of show the bigger picture, but then you have this very, very intimate view of people involved in it.
I mean, well, from the beginning, I was like, I have to find a way to make it not just sad. And I also needed a way to link together these seemingly disparate things like rhino horn in Vietnam and lizards in Indonesia and burning ivory in Kenya. And I thought, okay, maybe I can find like a character, but there's just not one person who's involved in all this because it's such a big convoluted thing.
Right.
And then I was like, well, I guess I could be the character, which is very uncomfortable for me as a journalist. I hate that.
Right.
But it was just like, this is a way to make it compelling, to make it one voice throughout the book, and to kind of take readers along on this journey of discovery that I undertook myself.
Yeah.
And also just to kind of make things lighter and funnier, because a lot of this, I'm just kind of, I felt like I was stumbling around in the dark trying to make things happen, and then like, something would like pop up, like illegal like pangolin scales on a market in China, and I'm like, oh, okay. So yeah, I wanted to convey that sense that I don't really know what I'm doing either. We're all along on this journey and this ride together.
Yeah. And I think you did that well, if I say so myself.
Oh, thank you.
But you inserted yourself into the story, but it's almost more like your reactions to things. You know, you're not like, I did this and I saved the day, and
yeah,
it's
I
like
definitely did not save the day.
But it was more like some of your very your comments on like what people are wearing, or how they're interacting with each other and stuff like that. It's a bit snarky in places, but I actually really enjoyed that, because that's like maybe because we come from the same sort of group of people or viewpoint because of similar experience. But I was like, yeah, that's exactly what
exactly
coming through my mind.
Yeah, a lot of it was just trying to keep like a straight face and roll with the punches. Like, okay, yeah, the illegal rhino horn user, of course he brought his rhino horn to a busy restaurant in an Oreo cookie tin.
Yeah.
Like, okay, that's what's happening now. For sure.
Yes, yeah, bizarre. And also bizarre how some of these people who are intimately involved in the illegal wildlife trade seem so open and willing to talk with a journalist about what they're doing.
For sure. And that was like a very sad realization for me, actually, because they're so open because they don't have to care, because there's no enforcement or sort of viewpoint over there or big viewpoint that this is quote unquote wrong. Like here in the West, we value animals generally speaking. If you wear ivory, you're probably gonna catch some shit from your friends,
right.
I would expect.
Yeah,
I mean, even if you wear fur. But that zeitgeist has not taken hold in the way it has here in the East. It's just a different approach to wildlife.
Yeah. So just interesting personal story about that. So I was involved in Chinese martial arts for a long time.
Oh, very
and my
cool.
teacher was from Hong Kong. And I remember I was asking him about some animal that was in one of the sets, the forms of Kung Fu, and he was like, oh, and it started this conversation about animals in China, and he was like, oh yeah, he's from the markets in Hong Kong. He said, oh yeah, you can get whatever you want.
Of course,
people have cages full of animals, and if you want this rare animal that's in this this Kung Fu form is named after, like, oh, no problem,
what
I
was
can
the
get
animal?
that
Do you
for
remember?
I think it might have been something like a civet. Because he didn't have, it was something like bear cat, and he couldn't.
Oh yeah, that sounds like a civet.
He couldn't really translate that into English. He was just like, and then he kind of dismissed it because he was like, I can't translate that. So anyways, but that was, I was like, the attitudes towards conservation are so different in Asia.
I mean, it's more like, okay, animals are here for our benefit and our use. And unfortunately, there's a lot of uses for them in China and Vietnam and places like that.
So that's like probably a good way to segue into talking about this character that you started the book with that I just found fascinating. I don't know how you pronounce it. I think it's Tam Ho.
Oh, Tam Ho.
Tam Ho,
yes,
pretty close.
Which is like eighth child or something. Yeah. Yeah, it's his nickname.
So he's a very interesting character, and based in Vietnam, animal trapper.
Yep.
Could you just maybe give the audience a little bit of a taste of
a
him
taste of Tam Ho.
A taste of Tam Ho.
Yeah, just
and
a
how
little
did
taste.
how did you meet
Yeah,
him
totally.
initially?
So Tam Ho goes back again to my days doing research as a master's student in Vietnam. I was trying to figure out how people use natural resources in this forest and if anyone hunted. And I was asking everybody, like, do you know anyone who hunts? And in this one tiny little village, we're talking like buildings made out of palm leaves and dirt roads and waters everywhere because I'm in a peat swamp. And everyone started pointing down the street and was like, oh yeah, the pangolin hunter lives there, the pangolin hunter. And I was really excited to meet him because I hadn't met any professional hunters yet, and I was really nervous, like, is this guy even gonna talk to me? Mm-hmm. But he was just this exuberant, kind of wacky guy with like crazy black hair everywhere and, like torn shirt, but super welcoming, like, yeah, come into my house. Like, I love education and students. I'll tell you all my secrets. So I interviewed him for my research, and he told me all these ways he traps animals. He makes his own homemade traps. He's figured out basically animal behavior and ecology. He knows what works for X species and what doesn't for Y. He made his living trapping animals and selling them to traders in a nearby city who then presumably would take them to even bigger cities, etc. So when I realized I wanted to write this book, I thought I need to find Tam Ho. And finding him was this whole thing. I got my old host sister who I lived with when I studied abroad in Vietnam involved. She had to like print out a Polaroid I had of him and like send it to another guy who took it around because nobody down there uses the internet. Okay. So we finally tracked down Tam Ho and asked him if he'd be willing to be interviewed for this book. And he's like, yeah, sure, whatever. So that was the step one. I journeyed back to Vietnam, back to this peat swamp where I spent 3 months and never thought I'd ever go back to. And he took me out, he and his wife, Lynn, on an early morning hunting expedition, which was just miserable. Mm-hmm. We're in this like rickety little boat, like going down these like black water canals. We're just surrounded by like swarms and swarms of mosquitoes. Every time we pass through like a bush, ants are just like raining down on us. There's leeches. And then getting out of the boat, it's like twice as hot. Like the humidity's oppressive. And I'm from Mississippi, so like when I say it's hot, like I mean it's freaking hot. But he showed me his traps and just the way this man moved through the forest. He was just so graceful and at home, at ease, and I'm like blundering around, like banging into trees. Luckily, we did not catch an animal on that day, but we saw like some scat from otters, and unfortunately Tam Ho was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna come back and catch those otters. But it was eye-opening.
Yeah, and so his specialty is pangolins, correct?
Yeah, I mean, he specializes in everything except monkeys because they creep him out because they look like little people, he said. But
so he does have some boundaries.
Yeah, that's his boundary. But pangolins are what he's really after because they're the biggest payday for him. I mean, they'll fetch like, I don't remember the exact figure, but it's something like $100 a pound. And they can weigh a few pounds, so that's big news for someone like Tam Ho.
Have you figured out, $200 say he got for a particular animal? I mean, what would that be equivalent in US dollars? Do you know?
Oh, let me check. Hold on.
Did you figure that out?
Let me just look up.
What, you don't have the currency exchange rate right off the top of your
Seriously. Head? Okay, so he can get like $450 US for a pangolin, and in this area, the average household earns about $1,000 per year.
Wow. So
with one animal, you're getting like half a year's salary. That would be like us. I'm not going to presume how much you make, but imagine getting like a $50,000 payday.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, who wouldn't hunt a pangolin under those circumstances? So yeah, talking to him, it was eye-opening, not just for learning the techniques he uses, but also understanding where he's coming from and putting a face on the hunter. It's not just some like evil guy. It's just a dude who has some kids and is making really obvious economic decisions.
Yeah, and one of the conservationists that you interviewed said, some of these animals, it's like they have, gold or heroin, on their face walking around, and it's like, why wouldn't someone like this
That's a great quote. Yeah, it's like a rhino's walking around with a big chunk of gold on its face, basically.
Yeah, it's just such a target for anybody that's wants money or needs money.
I think it's hard for people here to conceive of, but I mean, someone else told me they caught someone working in a national park in South Africa. They caught some poachers, and they were like, well, what are you doing? And they're like, well, like, we don't have any food, so we have to hunt this rhino. And they're like, well, what do you mean you don't have any food? And they're like, well, we're eating grass.
Wow.
And I mean, come on, like, of course they're going to try to hunt rhino. Like, you have to empathize with that.
Yeah, it's such a temptation. So I mean, I guess the question is, what in areas that are so economically depressed, where people are living on, $1 a day or less.
Right.
Like what are the solutions? What do you do for somebody like Tam Ho to get them to stop chasing these animals around and catching them?
I mean, that's the big question, right?
Yeah. You don't have all the answers?
Yeah.
Come on.
Just like development aid, please. I mean, until these communities are brought out of poverty, like, it's not going to ever end. Yeah. So there needs to be kind of a carrot and a stick approach. We need protection because people are going to try to hunt them. Yeah. But we also need to actually figure out ways to help the communities with aid, whether that's through ecotourism bringing dollars in, or recruiting hunters to be guides, or just building schools and jobs.
Yeah. So this is kind of a lingering question I have about conservation, and maybe you can answer it for me, but so development definitely like takes some of that incentive away from poaching.
For sure.
When people have other opportunity for other types of jobs like construction or
Definitely.
agriculture, but then that sort of like introduces a whole host of other problems, because then you have, habitat encroachment and, development and sort of habitat fragmentation and things like that. I mean, I don't know. I kind of wonder what the solution is, the long-term solution here.
I think increasingly we're going to see these kind of islands of nature that are strictly protected national parks, and everything else is just going to be gone.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, like, happy times. I mean, that's the case in Africa. Like, there's so much development and human pressure. Yeah. Unless things are really, there's boundaries put up. Yeah, it's going to be lost.
I mean, I guess as economic development increases, like birth rates and things go down. So like maybe we'll reach some equilibrium where sort of, we're not growing more as a population.
God, I hope so.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
But then you have this crazy stuff you talk about in your book, where it's like, people now, because these animals are so rare that it's almost become a status symbol. If you can have that served to you at dinner time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that mindset in Vietnam and China, that needs to change if these species are going to survive. But how to change that mindset is the $1 million question. I mean, there's like demand reduction campaigns going on, but like hitting people over the head with like, these animals are dying, like that message does not sink in or work for these consumers. And one of the messages that people think does work is one of fear. So think about the ad campaigns for drunk driving here. Like, if you drive drunk, you're going to kill a kid. Or if you do meth, you're going to be like horrible looking and no one's going to love you. So that's something that would probably resonate with these big guys eating wildlife. Like, if you do rhino horn, like, you just suck, and like you might get sick, which actually happens.
Oh, okay.
But the problem is the people funding these campaigns are attached to NGOs and donors in the West we want these like cushy, lovable, like save a rhino messages.
Right.
They don't want their money to be attached to these like brutal campaigns. So that's an issue.
Yeah, and that's interesting. So yeah, I think those ad campaigns against smoking and things,
yes,
exactly. the ones that have been effective are really gross. Like
yeah,
they'll show lungs
like
with
lungs.
all black lungs. So like maybe something with wild. I mean, those are the images that really I find that affect me is when you see a rhino carcass with the horns chopped off.
Yeah,
it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, again, we're like approaching it from such a different viewpoint. I think. Yeah, for us that works. For consumers, it's got to be something like problems that's going to happen to them.
So I wanted to talk a bit about pangolins in particular because I just think they're
Love pangolins.
Adorable.
They're awesome
and strange.
They're very weird
and foreign to people in North America.
Definitely.
So what is a pangolin and why are they sought after and why are they so highly trafficked?
So pangolins, also known as scaly anteaters, they are the world's only scaled mammal, but they're not actually closely related to anteaters, even though they eat insects like ants and termites. They're actually more closely related to dogs and cats than to anteaters. So, wow. They can roll into balls. Yeah, they are. Isn't that crazy? They're just not related
that had to sink in a minute, but I was like, what?
They're just really cool. There's all these crazy facts about them. Like their tongue can be as long as their body. It's like rooted kind of at the base of their stomach.
Oh, wow.
They can roll into a ball to escape predators. They have super core strength. Like they can hang from a branch by their tail and then like go out 90 degrees like a gymnast or something. Or 180 math again. They can go in a straight line there.
Right.
They're nocturnal, they're super shy, they're really passive. Like if you grab a pangolin, it's not gonna bite you. It's just gonna be like, oh my God. And why they're wanted. So in Asia and also in cultures throughout Africa, they are sought after as traditional medicine materials.
Yeah, where are they found?
Good question. So there's 8 species around the world. There's 4 in Africa, 3 in Asia, and 1 in India.
Okay, so just that part, not in the New World.
No, just Africa and Asia.
Okay.
But so their scales are used by traditional cultures around the world, wherever they're from, for various purposes. And in Asia, their meat is also considered a delicacy. And this was all fine, but the problem was wealth is going up in places like Vietnam and China. People can access things that they couldn't in the past. And as more people want these things, pangolins are just being hoovered out of forests to satisfy that demand.
And are they, I mean, if that wasn't happening, would they be fairly common animals?
Yeah, I mean, you talk to people like Tam Ho or people who grew up in Vietnam and they say, yeah, like I used to see pangolins crossing the road all the time and now that would just never happen.
So it'd be something like, I mean, they kind of remind me a little bit of armadillos in a sense.
Yeah, they look like that, like an armadillo, kind of like a pine cone armadillo. I don't know. Yeah, they definitely roll up into the little ball though, and they have that little snout.
But armadillos are fairly common animals, I think, in Texas
in the South for sure.
In the South, I don't know if they're where you grew up.
Oh yeah, armadillo roadkill was all over, sadly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wonder why they're sort of targeted as medicinal though. You know,
I think just because they look weird, to be honest. It's like they look conspicuous, so therefore they have to have some kind of intrinsic power.
Yeah.
And like traditional Chinese medicine draws on ingredients from hundreds of animals, so pangolins are no exception.
Yeah. Well, and I know a bit about Chinese medicine. There's also this idea that things that look like something will affect that part of the body in some way.
Right.
Like they, think that ginseng looks like, a spleen or something, and so then it would affect the spleen. So maybe there's some connection.
There's some of that, yeah. I don't know about pangolins because they are used for for example, to help mothers lactate. I don't really think they look like a boob, but you know, who knows?
No, I don't.
And, I mean, their scales are just keratin, like fingernails. So
yeah, like so many of these things, rhino horn. It's
just
literally
keratin, guys.
Fingernails.
Yeah, but I don't know. Someone put it to me like, it's almost like convincing someone who's religious, though, that there is no God or higher power. It's more of a true believer thing with medicine, Chinese medicine, than it is like evidence, science.
Yeah. So so I'm going to go way out on a tangent here, but in studying different sort of areas of philosophy and science and things like that. So the interesting with like traditional Chinese culture is that they never fully separated this idea of sort of like psychology from science, like the mind from the body, so to speak.
For sure.
So there's this connection, this overlap between that if you think something, it's will help you. It sort of does. There's no random controlled double blind placebo.
Right.
It's like if the placebo works, then that's it worked, right? So they don't have this like separate. They never had this separation of science.
Right.
They adopted that from the West, but they never developed that for themselves. So I almost wonder if that's where this thinking is sort of coming from.
And I mean, then you get into all kinds of gnarly, interesting things, like sometimes it does work because the placebo effect can be so strong.
Yeah.
So, if you take rhino horn and you feel like your hangover is cured, who's to say it doesn't work?
Yeah,
the mind is a powerful organ.
Right. But they've never found any, sort of physical mechanism for how these things would work. Like,
I don't remember seeing any. I'd have to check my book, but no control trials for pangolins. People have tried it on rhino horn a little bit. Funny enough, the Western scientists who have tried it have found no effect, whereas the Chinese scientists, of course, have found effects. But there's all kinds of issues with that. Yeah.
Well, and as you mentioned in the book, there are some traditional Chinese medicines that once they were tested, they did actually.
Bear bile is a great example of that. Bear bile actually works.
Oh, what is it? How's that?
Hold on, give me a second.
No worries.
Okay, ursodeoxycholic acid is the active ingredient in bear bile, and we actually have it too. All mammals make it. And the thing about it in bears is there's a lot of it in their bile, and that's because bears hibernate. And it seems like this acid, what it does is it prevents cell death. And that's why bears don't come out of their dens in the spring like completely emaciated and dying.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so there's researchers here in the US who have done all kinds of tests on it, and it does seem to have these, I hate to use the word miraculous, but it has some really profound effects.
Yeah.
The thing is, though, we can make that acid, and we can get it from, for example, cows that have been slaughtered, and purify it and deliver it in like nice pill form. But there's this thought that something about coming from the animal, it has this intrinsic power and purity. So users in China don't necessarily want it in this pill form from a company. They want it from the source, the animal. Yeah,
it sort of gets back to that idea of, sort of pre-science. Like there's this essential quality of an ingredient, and if you remove that from where it came from, then it's like, it doesn't have that
Exactly. I mean,
property anymore.
For sure. Like hardcore rhino horn users will actually say, like, no, I want it from a wild rhino. I don't want it from a farmed rhino. I don't want it from a lab in Seattle. There's one that's actually trying to make rhino horn. I want it from the animal because that's the wild animal, and I want that animal's power.
Yeah, it's almost magical.
Like exactly.
So yeah, that's really hard to
combat. Right?
Yeah. So we're running low on time, but I guess I just would, my final question to you, I guess, would be, who should read this book? Everyone
should read this book, of course.
But who do you think is going to be, like, who did you write it for?
I wrote it for people who aren't like tree-hugging animal rights activists. Like, those people are already converted. They get it. I wrote it for people who don't know that this is an issue necessarily, or have questions about it, who are curious about the world, who think the world might be a lesser place without wildlife, but they're not necessarily writing checks to WWF. And I hope that this book kind of pushes them in that direction and makes people more aware that this is happening, that things can be done to stop it, but without doing those things, we're going to lose a lot more wildlife.
Great. And it's so great to have all this information in like such a entertaining package.
Thank you. I mean, that's my intention. It's like, here's the info, do with it what you will. I hope people are moved to, maybe change their lifestyles or write a check or tell others about it.
And we're grateful to you for trekking through the swamp and braving the mosquitoes and going into some pretty hairy situations, as you can read about in the book,
My pleasure.
To sort of investigate this and get a real, because that's what I feel like we haven't seen, a real on the ground investigative approach to this issue, and it's fantastic.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. And we'll try to include a link to a website where you can purchase the book in the show notes for this inaugural episode.
Woo!
And we're done. And
Sweet.
Everybody have a great day.
Woo.
Bye.
Bye.
Well, that's it for this episode. As always, if you learned something new, be sure to smash the like and subscribe buttons. Also, click that little bell icon to get notifications when new episodes go live. Finally, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode, so please leave a comment or question below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.